Good afternoon and welcome to the Laurier Northern Webinar Series. This is a monthly series of virtual webinars that highlights Laurier's multidisciplinary Northern research, which is conducted in close collaboration with Northern communities, other institutions, and partners in the Northwest Territories and other Northern locations. For today's webinar, we have 4 speakers bringing you some different perspectives and research on wildfire in the North, impacts and adaptations. Before we begin, we will have a land acknowledgement. I acknowledge that Wilfrid Laurier University's Ontario campuses, situated on the Haldeman Tract, reside upon the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. This land holds significance as part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, symbolizing their commitment to sharing, safeguarding resources, and living in peace with each other. Today, this gathering place serves as a home to numerous First Nation and Métis and Indigenous communities from across Turtle Island. Additionally, we extend our respectful acknowledgement of Laurier's research activity in the Northwest Territories. Laurier has established permanent infrastructure in Yellowknife on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Dene, Inuit, and Métis people of the Northwest Territories, as well as the traditional territory of the Yellowknife Dene First Nation, Chief Jimmy Dry Geese Territory, and the homeland of the North Slave Métis. We further extend our respect to all First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people of the North who call this territory home. We are grateful to the Indigenous people of the Northwest Territories for allowing us the privilege of learning, working, and residing on their lands. Additionally, we deeply appreciate the generous sharing of traditional knowledge, wisdom, and ways of knowing. To express our gratitude, we can engage in continuous learning, open dialogue, and thoughtful reflection about the rich histories, cultures, and contributions of Indigenous peoples. Through our ongoing learning efforts, we aim to foster understanding and build meaningful relationships with the Indigenous communities on whose land we live and work. And with that, I will introduce our first speaker, Dr. Jennifer Baltzer, Professor and Canada Research Chair in Forests and Global Change in the Department of Biology at Wilfrid Laurier University.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here today. And before I get started on talking about some of the research results I'm going to share with you, I just wanted to, spend a few minutes to acknowledge, the really long, hard fire season that the NWT experienced this summer. So many of our friends and colleagues and partners were displaced because of fire this summer. More than 70% of NWT residents were evacuated this summer, some more than once. And so, anyone who feels that they can contribute to efforts to support evacuees, please consider contributing to the United Way Emergency Response Fund that is supporting so many folks who were displaced or who lost their homes or time away from their livelihood this summer. So just a very brief acknowledgement of that, really traumatic event that impacted so many of our friends and colleagues there. And for those of you on the call who might not be familiar with where the NWT is, it's up here in northwestern Canada, and it's just a wonderful spot full of very wonderful people. Okay, and to further expand on that, this summer 2023 was really an unprecedented wildfire season, not just in the Northwest Territories, but across Canada. At this point, I think this number is probably low at this point, but more than 17.5 million hectares of forested land have burned in Canada in 2023. And you can see that across the provinces, it was really nationwide. We saw record levels of burning in most provinces and territories across Canada, with nearly 10 times the normal rate of burning across the country. So this is really a really unusual and the word unprecedented was used a lot. Here we have a graph of the carbon emissions from this, which are just really astonishing and comprise a pretty large proportion of Canada's annual emissions. And so this is this wildfire event that occurred across the country has been attributed to climate change, and we just have to recognize the fact that with ongoing warming, we are facing a more fiery future, and have to think about how do we work together to help encourage mitigation. This is really the climate change is the proximal cause of what we're seeing, and we really need to encourage our governments to work toward reducing emissions. And we need to be thinking about how do we support communities that are at that interface between these forests and the urban areas that they're living in, the developed areas that they're living in, better support those communities in the face of this changing fire regime. So I just really wanted to highlight this fact. We are going to today be talking about results that largely came out of the last big fire year in the Northwest Territories, which was 2014. And I think, there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from that. There are lots of new questions that will most certainly come up from this year, but we're sharing a little bit of what we've learned from 2014 to think about, what we might expect following this big fire season. And with that, I'll just move on to my short presentation, which I'm a forest ecologist, and I have been working for the last 10 years on the impacts of fire in the Northwest Territories, thinking about, this has been in the context of 2014, which was the previously largest, prior to 2023, the largest fire season on record. And this has been an effort that has been, a work by many, many folks. And so just a quick acknowledgement to them here. So wildfire in the boreal, it's a really important part of this system. Wildfire is the main disturbance agent in the boreal biome, and it burns through at regular intervals in the Northwest Territories. This is around every 70 to 100 years, and it helps to maintain heterogeneity at the landscape level in stand structure and stand composition and stand age that is really important for supporting the biodiversity that makes up the boreal. That we see many amazing adaptations of species to this fire regime. A great example of this is black spruce, which has these wonderful semi-serotinous cones. There's this resinous coating on the cones that as fire moves through, it heats up that resin and allows the cone to sort of slowly open, releasing its seeds on the seed bed, on the fresh seed bed, which promotes self-replacement in these forests and has for millennia. Oops. But we have fire years like we saw this past summer and in 2014, where we're seeing really huge tracts of land burned that's impacting, larger than normal areas burn, more severe burning, more frequent burning. And this has implications for the communities that are impacted by these fires, but also for the ecosystems. And so a lot of work that we have been focusing on is trying to understand what are the ecological impacts of these fires. Following 2014, there were a couple of key questions that came through from communities, from government folks. And the first of those is, will the forests return the way they were after these really big fire years? And secondly, what are the impacts of fire on wildlife populations, particularly caribou? And I'm not going to fully address either of those questions in my short time today, but I just wanted to highlight that we've gained some understanding from 2014 that we may be able to apply to help us understand what we can expect from the fires this past summer. And so to address those questions and many others, we set up a network of sites across the Northwest Territories. All of these blue triangles are locations of permanent sampling sites that were developed in collaboration with the government of the Northwest Territories and in partnership with a number of communities. And many of these focused on 2014 fires, but we also extended that outward into sites that had burned further back in time. So the oldest sites we sampled had not experienced a stand replacing fire for a couple of hundred years. So the first question is, will the forests return the way they were? And now this looks like a very complicated graph, but I'll just walk you through it. Most of the stands that we sampled were black spruce dominated. And that was mostly what burned in 2014, these black spruce dominated sites. It made up a large proportion of stands that burned. And in each of these figures, so we have one from the Taiga Shield and one from the Taiga Plains. In each of these figures, there are a lot of arrows, and the arrows represent the tail of the arrow is where the stand was pre-fire, and the head of the arrow is where the stand ended up post-fire. And so what we see in both of these graphs is that there are a lot of arrows pointing away from the original stand type. And in most cases, this was black spruce. On the Taiga Shield, this transition was predominantly black spruce shifting toward birch. On the Taiga Plains, there was sort of an equal balance of black spruce shifting toward pine and black spruce shifting toward aspen. And this made up quite a lot of sites. So about 43% of the sites on the Taiga Plains showed a transition away from black spruce, and about 30% on the Shield. And this is only sites that stayed as forested sites. So we also saw about 10% of our sites not showing signs of regeneration up to 4 or 5 years after fire. So this suggests a transition from forested to non-forested in the face of some of the more severe burning in these areas. We looked at some of the mechanisms that were driving this. And so again, we saw a real consistency in the important drivers of whether the forest was resilient to these fires or whether it transitioned to a different composition following fire. One of the important drivers was the amount of organic layer that was left after fire. So where we had very complete combustion of the organic soils in these sites, we saw a much more frequent transition away from black spruce toward jack pine or toward birch or toward aspen. The other piece was stand age, where stands were younger, so where the fire return interval was shorter, we saw a higher likelihood that a stand would shift from black spruce toward jack pine or birch or aspen. So these compositional shifts happened more frequently where burning was more complete, so where we had more severe combustion of the soil organic layer, or where fire return interval was very frequent. And this is work by Ellen Whitman, led by Ellen Whitman at the Canadian Forest Service. And I just want to highlight this because we did see a lot of reburning this summer in 2023. And some of Ellen's work really targeted these very short interval fires. And so what we see from this is that where we have these very short interval fires, so in this case, less than 17 years, we see a much more dramatic reduction in conifer density, in total stem density. So the stands are thinning out, there's less conifers. Broadleaf species don't seem to be responsive to this. So this suggests that we have, a transition from conifer dominance to broadleaf dominance, but overall a stand thinning in these sites where we have really short interval fires. So this is, sort of the extreme end of things where forests that wouldn't normally burn in a fire year, because of these large fire years, they can get consumed in really short sequence. So just to sort of wrap up that little section, deep burning and frequent fires lead to these kinds of post-fire successional changes. So we move from something that looks like this with black spruce to something that looks like this with pine or aspen, as many of you would have seen driving around through some of those big fires on Highway 3. And this has consequences for any number of ecosystem services. One of the ones that I will talk about today is wildlife forage availability. So one of the second question I said I would sort of touch on is, what are the impacts of large fire years on wildlife populations, especially caribou? And I don't work with wildlife, but we do work with the things that wildlife eat. And this is a great example of this. It's beautiful cladina here in the picture. So this is caribou lichen, which makes up really important winter forage for both barren ground and boreal caribou in the Northwest Territories. And this was work that Xanthe Walker led in the NWT. And she looked at the recovery. So using that whole chronosequence of sites, she looked at the recovery of lichen forage through time. And what we found is that number one, it takes a long time for that to recover, between 50 and 75 years in the Northwest Territories to recover sort of peak biomass of lichen in these stands. And the second piece is different stands regenerate in different ways. So if you have a totally broadleaf stand, we don't see lichen recovery. The best, the places where we saw that the highest peak biomass, the best recovery is these poorly drained spruce stands. So when we think about that in the context of land cover change, those land cover changes have implications for how this caribou forage will recover. To take it out to some sort of adaptation or responses to this, one of the things we're trying is lichen seeding to see if, if there are places that are particularly important from a caribou perspective, or places that are really huge burns that require some nucleation of lichen on the landscape to help recover it. We're working on asking questions about, can lichen seeding help to do this? So adding fragments to the landscape and looking at the recovery. And what we found a couple years out from doing this is that the lichen fragments stay in place really nicely. They're really healthy. And you can see this little guy hugging this charred piece of woody debris. They're forming, they're growing, and they're forming structures that help them to colonize. So this seems very promising for some particular applications. So just to wrap up, I just want to, highlight that a lot of the work that we've done in response to the 2014 fires, it doesn't answer all the questions to what we will want to know from 2023, but it has been a really big collaborative effort across, communities and government and academics to help to address some of the questions that have come to light. And I just really hope that we can continue to move forward in that collaborative capacity to help support the questions and the needs coming out of this past fire season. And with that, I will thank you and stop sharing my slides.
Thank you, Jen. Our next speaker is Dr. Xanthe Walker, Assistant Professor at the Center for Ecosystem Science and Society at Northern Arizona University.
I just want to thank you for the invitation to speak here today, and thanks to everyone for attending online. It's nice to see so many participants interested in wildfire in the north. Before I get started, I would just like to acknowledge the various communities, academic institutions, funding agencies, and a long list of co-authors for supporting the research that I'm going to talk about today. So I can switch slides. So wildfires are often thought of solely destructive in nature, but most terrestrial ecosystems have really evolved over millennia in the presence of wildfires. And ecosystems that are able to maintain or recover their structure and function in the face of a wildfire are considered resilient to it. And so thinking about black spruce regenerating to black spruce that Jen talked about is a form of structural resilience. But in terms of function, one of the most globally important functions of the boreal forest is the ability to store large amounts of carbon. So just to put it into context, although the boreal forest occupies about 17% of terrestrial Earth, it stores over 30% of carbon from terrestrial ecosystems. And that's more than what is currently present in the atmosphere. And the vast majority of it is stored below ground in these thick and old organic soils. And these organic soils accumulate in part via escape from combustion. So with each fire event, these soil carbon pools that we term legacy carbon accumulate because some portion is actually escaping combustion. And that leads to a net accumulation of carbon from the atmosphere over multiple fire cycles and makes the boreal forest this net carbon sink. But this net carbon sink might be threatened by climate warming, changing boreal forest wildfire regimes. And that's shown here with total area burned in different ecoregions of the western boreal forest. So you can see that it's increasing over time and also increasing in severity and fire frequency, so shortened fire return intervals. So that leads me to my primary research question of assessing how a changing fire regime could alter the carbon balance of boreal forests or alter that functional resilience of the ecosystem. So I'm briefly going to cover results from 4 papers. The first is just estimating how much total carbon was combusted from those 2014 fires Jen talked about. The second is really important for understanding the net ecosystem carbon balance, or whether or not legacy carbon combusted. And then the third is thinking about how much carbon accumulates post-fire in different forest types. So when we see these shifts in successional trajectories. And then the last is assessing, well, when alternate trajectories of deciduous forests burn, how much carbon is then emitted from them? So the first paper is from work we did in the Northwest Territories, assessing both the drivers of carbon emissions and then scaling carbon emissions to the entire area burned. And for this again was the 2014 fires. It was the largest area burn on record for the region at that time. Now, of course, that's changed, and we wanted to see how much carbon was emitted from them. And what we found was that carbon emissions were highest in these moderately well-drained black spruce stands, which is shown in those two figures on the left. And this was independent of fire weather conditions, as depicted in the illustration on the right-hand side. So in this extreme fire event, the fire weather didn't really matter. It was extreme everywhere. And then the most important predictor of carbon emissions were these bottom-up drivers of fuel availability. So what is actually on the landscape and is available to burn. And when we scaled these combustion estimates to the entire 2014 burned area, we found that about 94 teragrams of carbon burned. And that's equivalent to 50% of total carbon uptake in all terrestrial ecosystems of Canada in 1 year. So a lot of carbon was emitted to the atmosphere. So from this study, we knew how much carbon was combusted, but in order to understand if these emissions result in a shift from sink to source, we need to understand legacy carbon combustion. So for this, we're looking at a subset of sites in the Northwest Territories. And we assessed if legacy carbon combusted by looking at stand age at the time of fire and radiocarbon dating organic soil samples. And from this, we can say legacy carbon was combusted if stand age is younger than the soil surface, meaning fire burned more organic soil than was able to accumulate since the previous fire. And we did this in 28 sites that experienced the historic fire frequency and 9 sites that were young or experienced a shortened fire return interval. So what do we find? Well, here we see that the probability of legacy carbon combusting decreases with stand age, and the vertical dotted line differentiates young burn plots from old. And you can see that legacy carbon only combusted in one of the old burn plots, but in about half of the young ones. And that's because of the shorter time between consecutive fires, really limiting organic soil accumulation and resulting in a more superficial position of legacy carbon. So it's really the burning of these young age stands that renders legacy carbon vulnerable to combustion. And I've depicted that here with fires burning into legacy carbon when the fire cycle is less than or equal to 60 years old. So as the frequency of boreal forest fires is projected to continue increasing with climate warming and drying, we saw a lot of reburning that happened this past year. This is going to increase the proportion of younger forests on the landscape vulnerable to burning, which will increase the loss of legacy carbon and the proportion of forests that are shifting from this historic carbon sink to a carbon source. So getting back to that original question, can wildfires shift the carbon balance? The short answer is, of course, yes. We found that legacy carbon was lost in younger age stands, making it a net carbon source. But what about carbon dynamics after wildfire? For this, we really need to know whether carbon accumulation during post-fire recovery compensates for carbon emissions from fire. And this was work led by Michelle Mack to assess the trade-off between carbon losses from fire and then shifts in successional trajectories. And here we use data from over 170 sites in interior Alaska, and all sites were black spruce pre-fire. Then we examined 3 different post-fire trajectories, so those returning to spruce, those becoming a mixed spruce deciduous stand, or those becoming deciduous dominated. And we incorporated both how much carbon was lost and then how much reaccumulated. So sites that transitioned from spruce to deciduous lost much more carbon during the fire. So at time point 0, they had less carbon, right? But then carbon pools accumulated 4 times faster in deciduous trajectories compared to spruce. So even though we had higher instantaneous losses of carbon in the deciduous trajectory associated with the deep burning of those organic soils, this loss was completely offset by high rates of reaccumulation. And this was due to accumulation in tree biomass, not in the organic soils, and that's depicted here. So basically, carbon loss from severe burning was offset by the high productivity of deciduous trees. But then the question is, well, what happens when these deciduous forests burn? What happens to that carbon storage? So this was work done in our lab led by master's student Betsy Black, and we assessed how pre- and post-fire carbon pools and wildfire carbon losses vary across these different forest types. And so here we have sites that range all across Alaska and the Yukon territories. And here's what we found. And there's a lot of information here, but let's just look at that first panel. Here we have pre-fire carbon pools with above ground tree carbon as the more transparent part and below ground as the darker colors. So similar to our previous finding, you can see that pre-fire deciduous stands store more carbon than spruce, and the majority of this is of course above ground. And then looking at the second panel, we can see that after a wildfire, a lot of this carbon is still on the landscape as dead standing trees. So because it's all stored in the trees, it remains after fire. They don't completely combust. And that's because the majority of combustion really comes from the soils and very little is lost from the trees. So this results in total combustion from deciduous forests being about half of what is lost on average from black spruce sites. And those mixed stands fall somewhere in the middle. So to get back to our original question, we already know yes, for the combustion of legacy carbon could shift to a net carbon source. And it also seems to be a yes for the shift from spruce to deciduous that can result in a net carbon sink. And this is true even when they burn. Carbon will likely stay on the landscape longer in the standing wood that slowly decomposes. But in order to understand how continued climate warming and wildfire disturbance will continue to impact the carbon balance of the boreal forest, we need to know the drivers of reburning or increased fire frequency. And we also have to assess the drivers of fire occurrence in deciduous forests. When and why do young forests or deciduous forests burn when they have historically been resistant to fire? And is this resistance changing with increased climate warming and drying? It is really these self-regulating feedbacks between fire and vegetation that can stabilize regional fire regimes, but we don't know if the fire vegetation feedbacks are going to promote resilience or drive vulnerability to state change. And we need to understand this to ultimately determine the magnitude and direction of the feedback between increasing wildfire carbon emissions and climate warming. With that, I would like to thank you all for your time and attention, and I'm looking forward to discussing after the next talks.
Our next speaker is Dr. Andrew Spring, Professor and Canada Research Chair in Northern Sustainable Food Systems in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at Wilfrid Laurier University.
So hi everyone, my name is Andrew Spring, as we said, and I'm going to take you away from maybe looking at the forest ecosystem into how communities were impacted by the forest fires in 2014, and more specifically, impact on community food systems. So 2014 for myself is when I started working in the Northwest Territories. And so I started working with the Kagitu First Nations in Kikisa. And so this is really a story about their experience with fire, and I'm happy to share it. So as we all remember, in 2014, Kikisa was directly impacted by the 2014 fires, and of course in the news, and they were evacuated in June of 2014. If you were to visit the community even today, it burned right up to the edge of the community. So you can, as you drive in, you see the first house on the right, and then on your left is still the burn as far as you can see. And really this community was saved by some previous SMAR farting, some hard work by the community members and the fire crews and the NWT, as well as just luck and good weather sometimes, right? Yeah, at the time, Kikisa was the only community really directly impacted at that time. And so the work that I do in the community was really about the impacts of climate change on community food systems. And so, of course, having just gone through this evacuation and the impacts of the fire, fire was very much directly on people's minds. And so we really got a very good snapshot on kind of how the community was feeling and really what they wanted to do about the impacts of fire. So, of course, the immediate impacts of fire, mental health and trauma, I think a lot of folks can relate to that. There was a really good study done called Summer of Smoke. Maybe we forgot about it because it was about 10 years ago, but the link is right there. It was a really good video on the impacts of fire and the smoke and the problems that it caused in communities, and then Kikisa is very much highlighted there. But really, the conversations happened around the destruction of land, their limited access to the land. A lot of the community's trails were destroyed. For the women, the loss of berries was very sad and upsetting to many folks. Of course, loss of community trap lines as well, but also the displacement of animals. Where the women were very upset that a lot of their kind of berry patches and their traditional foods were impacted. The males in the community were pretty flexible. They couldn't go to this area, but it means they were happy just to go to other places. But of course, that does have impacts on your food system in terms of more time, more resources, and travel to places that maybe they haven't traveled for a while. So there is a bit more risk when that happens. But that was some of the immediate impacts that people shared with us. But we did get to understand a little bit of the story of fire in the community of Kikisa. And really, there's a rich history there, which I think, and a lot of experience, which I think has really helped in some of the work that we're doing there, and really the community's understanding of the fire system. So the community was actually impacted by fires back in 1930. And you can't really see it here, but you can see Tathlina Lake at the bottom. Cameron Hills is just below that, and there was a large fire there in 1930, and the community was actually living down there at the time. And of course, with the impacts of the fire had on Tathlina Lake, the community was actually displaced all over the landscape until they settled back into where the current community is in probably about the 1960s. So fire burned again through in 1980, and then again in 2014. And then I guess this past summer, there were some fires close to this area. But they, I guess they were evacuated again this summer. But again, they had a lot of experience in dealing with this. And that past experience was very valuable. So, fire obviously is a very traumatic thing on the landscape, and very traumatic for communities who have to go through evacuations. But there was this understanding of the community about the natural cycle that fire is. And a lot of the harvesters commented is that some of the places that burned was really hard to get through and really overgrown. And so they were kind of saying that it kind of needed to burn because it just needed to be kind of cleaned up. And there was a general understanding that really, like once the land heals and the food starts to regenerate, that's when the animals start to come back. And so there was just really this plan to shift where they were accessing food from for the time being until the land that had burned grew back. There was some questions and some uncertainty, and then Jen and Xanthe also kind of talked about some of this work about like, okay, well, what does fire regeneration mean in a time of climate change? And I think those are kind of ongoing questions and concerns. But really, they did welcome this research and are very much a part of a lot of the research happening on not only on food systems, but in some of the firework as well. And particular emphasis to work with youth. And here's a picture of actually one of Jen's students working with the school in Kikisa around just education around what's growing back in the community, just to kind of, help the kids understand what changes are happening on the land. And so, just pictures of what this looks. So this was 2016. This is kind of what it looks like 2 years after the burn. And you can see, not a lot going on. Again, wintertime, things are starting to regenerate. But I wanted to show you this picture. And again, these aren't the same places. This is not a fancy time lapse. This is just me taking pictures of the landscape there. But you can see in 2022 here, you see a lot of the trees that burned are now actually falling over. And we're seeing that a lot across the landscape in Kikisa as well. There are some longer term impacts of fire that we really have to kind of be concerned about. So there's clearly a safety concern of falling trees, but also trails are still blocked and still need to be cleared, or they're continuing to kind of be blocked by these falling trees. So even 8, 9, 10 years after the last fire, we're still seeing the impacts of that forest fire on the ability of folks to be on the land and access traditional food sources. And of course, the berries haven't necessarily grown back either, and that's also kind of compounded by a few dry years. So it hasn't maybe been the best for berries in some places, but still an ongoing issue. But I do want to highlight some of the things that the communities want to do. And this is some of the work that a colleague of mine, Alex Latta, has been leading for the past while, is helping the community get access to funding to clear some of these trails. Okay, and the community has kind of taken this on to not only clear some of these trails, but try to expand a larger network of trails to places that they frequently access. Again, this kind of dovetails in with some of the harvester safety work we've been doing, is alleviating some of the risk of being on the land with climate change. And so the community has really emphasized clearing of land, but also the establishment of these emergency cabins. So again, it's this one thing saying, well, we're going to, adapt to climate change through, clearing trails and I guess repairing some of the damage of the last fire, but also continuing to adapt to ensure that we have better access to the land and have the infrastructure on the land to provide safety for harvesters along the way. Because we know that climate change is adding a lot of risk to harvesters traveling across the land. And I think, and so I guess moving forward, and this is a really interesting article from CBC, and there's Chief Floyd Chico right there, is that really the uncertainty of fires and floods and climate change that's happened in for a lot of NWT communities. They've really wanted to become more self-sufficient and starting to produce more food, or at least be be more self-sufficient, just to ride out some of the bumps that might happen with road closures and all these things that are becoming a bit more frequent in the north. So it was actually the rebuilding from the fires in 2014 that has really instigated some of the food work that we're currently doing in the community. And with that, I will leave it, but thank you very much for listening.
Our final speaker is Carla Johnston, PhD candidate at the Balsillie School of International Affairs in Waterloo, Ontario.
All right. Hi, everyone. Hello, I'm Carla Johnston, a PhD candidate at the Balsillie School of International Affairs, working with Dr. Alison Blais-Palmer, as well as Dr. Andrew Spring, who you just heard speaking. I'm really looking forward to talking with you today about the participatory action research I have worked on with Coggy-2 First Nation to create a firebreak food forest as an adaptation to the wildfire that happened in 2014 that impacted their community so greatly. I'm calling in from Waterloo, Ontario, which is located on the shared territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. This land is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, as well as the Haldimand Proclamation, which promised 6 miles on each side of the Grand River to be enjoyed forever by the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations, who now reside on only 5% of this original territory. However, the research that I am discussing with you today took place in Kikisa Northwest Territories, which is the home of Coggy-2 First Nation. And so you can see Kikisa here on the map, close to the bottom right of the screen, right next to Great Slave Lake. And at the top left of the screen, you can see where that is in the context of Canada. Kikisa is within the Daitcho Dene region of Denenda, the land of the Dene peoples. This land is part of Treaty 11 and is shared with the Métis peoples. Here is Kikisa. It's a really beautiful place. In this picture, you can see Kikisa Lake as well as Kikisa River. And you can also see the 2014 burn scars to the left of the community, as well as in the bottom right across the river. So to begin, the idea of a firebreak food forest came from a trip to Brazil that Dr. Spring and Chief Floyd Chico took to learn about agroforestry in 2019. And so agroforestry is a biodiverse land use system that integrates trees in agricultural landscapes. And it has a number of different benefits that cross sociocultural, environmental, and economic lines. And you can see some of these on the infographic on the screen. Things like helping to preserve the biodiversity of forested ecosystems, conserving water and carbon within soils, increasing food security and economic security for the folks that are producing foods, as well as having more nutrient-rich foods that are coming from the nutrient-rich soils of forested ecosystems. And particularly for Indigenous communities, it helps to preserve cultural ways of being that are have been part of the traditional food systems in forested landscapes for millennia. And so what is a firebreak food forest? So a firebreak, firebreaks are a cleared area of forest that fire managers use to stop the progression of wildfire when it approaches a community. So in the picture here on the screen, what you can see in the yellow shaded area is a proposed firebreak for Kikisa. So all of the area within the yellow shaded area would be, all of the trees and vegetation would be removed from that space. Firebreaks are a bit of a controversial fire management technique. A traditional knowledge holder has told me that ground should really not be cleared and left empty. And so the idea of a firebreak food forest is that a firebreak doesn't have to be just cleared land. It can also help to meet a community's food systems needs through 3 different ways. First, the cleared area can be used for sustainable agriculture. This is a firebreak farm of sorts. Second, the forest that edges the sides of a firebreak can be used for agroforestry, integrating grown foods within the canopy of the forest. Third, by consulting with community members on the location of a firebreak, it can act as a connection to traditional trails, similar to what Andrew was talking about, and to trap lines for improved access into the forest for hunting, trapping, and gathering. I began working with KTFN on the Firebreak project when I traveled to Kikisa in 2021. This trip was all about building relationships and trust with the community, which is the foundation of participatory action research. PAR is a methodology that creates collaborative research relationships between academics and community members to further the needs and aspirations of the community through knowledge creation and action. And so what it means to integrate action with research means that the researchers and community members work together to do the on-the-ground work that makes community goals a reality. So an example of this, another PAR project in Kikisa is the garden and greenhouse that Andrew mentioned, and several researchers, including myself and Andrew, have worked alongside community members in doing the hands-on work of establishing and maintaining the garden. And you can see a picture of me here on the left harvesting some vegetables from the greenhouse. On this trip in 2021, I connected with an elder that is really keen on this Firebreak food forest project. She sees the Firebreak as a place to replant berry patches that were lost in the 2014 fire, as Andrew mentioned, and that this Firebreak can also act as a corridor for animals to travel throughout the bush. The picture that you see on the right of the screen are low bush cranberries, and this is near one of the burn scars from 2014. The elder told me that the area that burned in 2014 was full of berries like this. So this June of this year, we held a community workshop in Kikisa where we used participatory methods to discuss with community members their questions, concerns, ideas, visions of what this Firebreak project could have. There was actually quite a bit of excitement and interest in growing traditional berries in the Firebreak. This was the most common idea for the Firebreak. Folks liked that it would be an accessible place close to town to be able to go picking. Others mentioned that the soil in the Firebreak may be better for growing potatoes than where they currently have their potato patch now. Some members even thought of ideas of not just growing food for themselves, but also to support wildlife. For example, there is the idea of growing grains to support geese and ducks. And there was interest in growing food that rabbits like to help support trapping. There's also interest in making a trail through the Firebreak that is accessible for those with mobility issues in the community. There was one concern that was quite clear from community members was that they want the Firebreak to do the job of protecting from fire. So no part of the Firebreak project should hinder from this fundamental function of the Firebreak. So based on this community feedback and community ideas for the project, we were about to set up a pilot project this past August, but this year's devastating fire season hindered those plans. The week that we were going to do the hands-on work within the Firebreak was the week that Kikisa received an evacuation order. So the plan had been that In one of the areas that has already been cleared close to the community, in the previous map, you saw some red shaded areas. So in one of those areas, we were going to start experimenting with regrowing berries. One of the test plots is the cleared area within with no trees. And then a second area is on the edge, the forested edge of that space. And so the cleared area is the first picture on the screen, and then the forested area is the third picture on the screen here. And so when we were setting up these plots, we noticed that there are already wild berry plants growing. In the cleared area, there are wild strawberry plants, which is the second picture on the screen. And in the forested plot, there are low bush cranberries, which you can see on the fourth picture. This gave us some tips to try in each plot of what we should try in each plot. In the cleared plot, we would like to try berries that like lots of sun and drier soils, such as raspberries and strawberries. In the forested plot, where it's cooler and the soils are more able to hold moisture, we would try bog-loving berries, such as high bush cranberries, low bush cranberries, bog blueberries, and cloudberries. So to get the berry plants, to actually be able to plant them, we had the plan to go out in the bush with community members to find well-established berry patches and dig up a portion to transplant into the test plots. This was the preferred method by community members instead of buying commercial varieties of berries. There's also interest in propagating local wild berries through cuttings of existing plants. Another key part of these test plots would have been irrigation. So this is important for establishing the transplanted berries, as well as helping the existing berries to flourish, but it's also a further adaptation to wildfire. Wetter soils burn less easily. By talking with community members, we came up with a plan of setting out drip irrigation lines in the test plots that could be hooked up to a mobile water tank filled with river water that a community member would bring over to the Firebreak area. So while we weren't able to do the work that we had planned this summer, we're hopeful that we'll be able to do and bring this plan to life next summer. And so just to kind of finish off here, to say that this can be done in other communities. Spaces like you see in the screen could support local food systems. Many fire breaks were created quite quickly this summer to protect from the fires. And there are plans to create fire breaks for every NWT community into the future. In some of the preliminary conversations with other communities, the chief in Samba Cay is very interested to see how the transplanting of berries go, as he is also interested in reestablishing berries that were lost in this fire year in 2023. Also, from my experience of living in Yellowknife, there were lots of issues of accessible land for farming and gardening. It would be interesting to see if the fire breaks created this summer could be turned into agricultural spaces. And this is something that could be supported by the city, as well as the government of Northwest Territories' local food and agriculture plans. And as a final note here, for other communities that might be interested in a Firebreak food forest, an important lesson that came from the work with Coggy2 First Nation is that community buy-in really comes from taking the time to build trust and listen to communities about their concerns and ideas. And with that, I will say thank you very much. Looking forward to any questions you have, and thanks for listening in today.
Thank you, Carla. We do have time for questions. Question for Andrew.
I can.
Yeah,
I'll just read. Yeah. So was it something that's gradually happening? It seemed to. Yeah, it took a few years to kind of kick in. But even I was chief took me out to the 1980. Gosh, it seems like it years ago. And there's still trees kind of falling over there to this day, right? So yeah, the way that the community experiences is that it's more deadfall than kind of permafrost or anything other than that. Just the trees just kind of burnt and were just kind of falling over. But Yeah, but it is kind of an ongoing thing. And so Chief actually took me on that road that they were kind of clearing all the way down to Tathlina. And there was lots of examples of, yeah, trees just kind of falling over from the previous fires, but also through some other things. So yeah, I guess that's a very complicated answer to say, like, the dead trees are falling over, but there are some like longer term processes happening there of like injured trees or whatever that continue to fall over time.
I could just jump in there and add to Andrew's answer. We typically see trees really start to fall over after about 8 to 10 years. So the time frame that Andrew showed is about right. And it's really interesting if we think about the impacts of that for wildlife. There's some ongoing work happening, asking questions about, because there's evidence from the 2014 fires that, for example, caribou were using some of these really new burns, but that maybe they are starting, that they stop using these newer burns as a lot more of this woody debris comes down. So there's these dynamics that are really interesting post-fire in terms of how the trees come down, what that means for use of the landscape, sort of permeability of the landscape by wildlife. So it's yeah, lots of ongoing work happening on that, Chinyu.
Great, thank you. There's also a question for Carla. How will transforming burned areas for farming or gardening impact biomass in the long term?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I'm not a natural scientist, so bear with me here. An important distinction to make here is that fire breaks are areas that will be cleared for fire management purposes. So these are not areas that have burned, but areas that are used for fire management. And they're areas that will already have been cleared. So they are going to be cleared no matter what. This is just trying to bring an extra use into this space instead of it just being completely cleared land. But your question is actually quite important to talk about how farming and gardening will impact the long-term biomass. And my general understanding, and natural science folks help me out if I get things wrong here, is that the clearing of land for agriculture will have significant impacts on biomass as well as carbon going up into the atmosphere. At the same time, the act of agriculture can also sequester carbon into the soil. And so there can be a way to balance out some of the carbon loss that's done from clearing land. But I do really want to reiterate that we don't want to clear more land than is already cleared in the Northwest Territories. We want the existing forests to stay where they are, not to transform the landscapes in really large ways, but in areas where land is already going to be cleared, how can we use that in ways to help support food systems?
Great, thank you, Carla. For Jen, with forests transitioning away from black spruce, it sounds like lichen seeding, even if it is successful, might not be successful bringing back the same level of lichen cover, just because the new forest won't be so hospitable for it. What does this mean for wildlife in the long term?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to, thanks, Alex. I think we have to think about, matching up where you might use some of these management interventions. If you have a stand that is transitioning toward deciduous dominance, it's not going to be a good use of resources or time to try to seed that area with lichen. From a wildlife perspective, those stands will be used for some, by other wildlife. So for example, moose really like young deciduous stands. So, different species will make use of different parts of the land as it moves from black spruce to other species. And there are other, a wide range of implications for those kinds of transitions. But certainly when thinking about any of that sort of management intervention, you would absolutely want to think about pairing up the treatment with a place that it's going to be successful. And these are some of the questions we're asking with this work. Is we've put these lichen fragments into different environments that burned in 2014 to see, okay, if we put them in, wetter landscapes or drier landscapes or, forests with permafrost, what is the outcome? And so that will provide some guidance in terms of where you might think about trying to use this kind of, kind of post-fire acceleration of lichen recovery. So it wouldn't be everywhere, but we'll have some better guidance in the very near future. But certainly you're right. Anywhere that's transitioned to a boreal stand, it would not be a good use of time or resources.
Great, thanks, Jen. This may be a question for Xanthe. Are there any conclusions yet on whether the boreal is a net carbon sink or a source this decade?
Yeah, that's a good question, and not something that I directly work on, but people have definitely estimated this over the entire North American boreal forest or even global boreal forest. And there's a ton of uncertainties associated with it, of course, right? It all depends. But I think it's still considered this net carbon sink, especially when we think of post-disturbance dynamics and there's this reaccumulation, but a lot of this isn't taking into account that legacy carbon component. So it's just like emission from a disturbance versus then post-fire accumulation and, maybe increasing productivity of some forests with climate and decreasing productivity of other forests with climate change. And so I think incorporating these source of carbon emissions is a really important component to consider when we're thinking about sink source dynamics as well. That has not yet been done as far as I know.
I think another important thing to add to that is that a lot of these forests are on permafrost, and fire and permafrost interact with one another. So when you burn these permafrost landscapes, it can accelerate thaw. In many places this will recover, but in southerly parts of the boreal where you have really, patchy permafrost, that fire can be the nudge that leads to loss of permafrost from the landscape, which then further exacerbates some of the carbon loss issues. So I think it's that's one of the additional complicating factors that Xanthe alluded to.
Yeah, and that definitely has not been included in any large scale models of it, this permafrost fire interaction, and is a very important component.
Okay, the next question is for Carla. In Whitehorse, Yukon, you've been discussing fire breaks with traditional berries as well. Did you hear any concerns from the community you worked with about increased bear activity due to the berries so close to town?
Yeah, thank you. And that's exciting to hear that there are other communities that are interested in growing berries in fire breaks. I had heard a few whispers that things like this were happening, as well as in Alaska. So it's great to hear that you're on the call today. Yes, I did hear concerns from the community about increased bear activity, but the feedback was actually mixed between the community members. Some folks were concerned about the amount of wildlife, particularly bears, coming close to the community due to berries. But then there were others that said that the Firebreak will actually help to be a corridor for animals to move instead of coming into the community. So the bears can eat the berries out in the Firebreak when people are not there, and that's actually helping to support wildlife, and that will hopefully not bring the bears into the community. But of course, there were concerns and safety concerns about when people go to pick the berries in those areas, and that's when kind of methods to deter bears from that area could be used, and that can be used using traditional practices of going berry picking in other places as well. Because traditional berry picking also has the concern of running into bears even on its own. So there was a bit of mixed feedback on those things. And something that we'll continue to discuss with community members about how to go forward with that.
Before we go, I'd also like to highlight 2 of the upcoming webinars as part of this series. In November, we have a webinar on aquatic ecology in the North, featuring a range of speakers on fish, freshwater food webs, and biodiversity. And in January, we will be having a webinar on wildlife and wildlife habitats. Thank you for everyone for joining today, and thank you very much for all the participants and speakers. We hope to see you at the next webinar. Thank you very much.